My father is our town's beloved old-fashioned mailman. I found his secret room. It's a surveillance hub where he's been reading the town's mail for 30 years. It all started with a leaky pipe. The basement of my childhood home smells like damp earth and the ghost of my mother's laundry detergent, a scent that's both comforting and a little heartbreaking. I'd been home for 2 months, helping Dad sort through her things, or at least that was the excuse. The truth is, I think we were both just too lonely to be in our own houses. The leak was coming from behind the ancient, hulking furnace that my dad always swore had another 20 years in it. I was wedged back there with a wrench and a flashlight, the cold concrete seeping through the knees of my jeans, when I saw it. A section of the cinder block wall that didn't quite match. The mortar was newer, cleaner. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were staring at it for an hour while trying to tighten a rusted bolt. My dad, Daniel, is a walking Norman Rockwell painting. He's been on the same mail route in our small town of Northwood for 3 decades. He knows who's having a baby, who's sick, who's getting a scholarship. He leaves dog biscuits on the porch for the golden retriever on Elm Street and always has a piece of hard candy for little Sarah Miller. He's the steady, predictable heartbeat of our community. The guy with the perpetually cheerful whistle and the worn leather satchel that's practically an extension of his arm. The idea of him having any secret at all, let alone a secret that required new mortar, was just impossible. It didn't compute. Curiosity is a funny thing. It can feel like an itch you can't scratch. I pushed on the weird section of wall. Nothing. I knocked on it, and the sound was different. Not solid. It was a hollow, dull thud that echoed in the quiet basement. My heart started doing a nervous, fluttery thing against my ribs. I went to his workbench, grabbing a small crowbar, my hands feeling clumsy and foreign. I told myself I was just checking for water damage, a shoddy repair job, but I knew I was lying. Back in the tight space behind the furnace, I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam and pried. For a second, there was resistance, and then a soft, grinding scrape. A perfectly square section of the wall, about 4 feet by 4 feet, swung inward into darkness. The air that wafted out was different from the musty basement air. It was dry, cool, and smelled faintly of ozone, like a computer that's been running for too long. I pointed my flashlight into the opening, and my breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't some forgotten storage closet. It was a room, small and meticulously organized. The walls were lined not with shelves of old preserves, but with corkboard. A massive, detailed map of Northwood was pinned to the main wall, the kind of map you'd see in a police station. But this one was covered in a spider web of colored yarn, connecting houses with thin lines of red and blue and yellow. Filing cabinets, sleek and metal, their drawers labeled not with letters of the alphabet, but with street names: Oak Lane, Maple Avenue, Chestnut Drive. I stepped inside, my feet silent on the clean-swept concrete floor. In the center of the room was a simple wooden desk. On it sat a small, high-intensity lamp, a magnifying glass, and a delicate-looking set of tools, like a watchmaker might use. And next to them, an electric kettle and a device I didn't recognize at first, a slim metal wand attached to a small vapor unit. Then I saw the stack of letters on the corner of the desk, and a cold dread washed over me. I picked one up. It was addressed to the Henderson family 3 blocks over. The seal on the envelope was perfect, but when I held it under the light, I could see a faint, almost imperceptible ripple in the paper along the flap. He was steaming them open. The kettle, the tools, the magnifying glass. This wasn't a hobby. It was an operation. The man who taught me how to ride a bike, who quizzed me on state capitals, who held my mom's hand in the hospital until the very end, he was a spy in his own town. And as I stood there, surrounded by the secrets of everyone I had ever known, I heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. His old station wagon was home. The jingle of his keys at the back door sounded like a countdown. My blood went cold and thick in my veins. Panic, pure and primal, seized me. For a frozen second, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was a trespasser in a secret history, a boy caught where he shouldn't be. The jingle of the keys stopped, followed by the familiar thud of the back door closing. He was in the kitchen, directly above me. I could hear the floorboards creak as he walked toward the fridge. I had seconds. My hands, slick with a sudden sweat, found the edge of the heavy cinder block door. I pulled. It didn't budge. It was perfectly balanced, but heavy. I put my shoulder into it, my muscles screaming in protest, my mind screaming at me to be silent. The door began to swing shut with a low, grinding groan that sounded like a gunshot in the tomb-like quiet of the basement. I froze, listening. Above, the refrigerator door opened and closed. He hadn't heard. I pushed again, this time with agonizing slowness. My teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached. The last few inches were the worst, a slow-motion nightmare of scraping stone. It finally settled into place with a soft, definitive thump. I nearly collapsed with relief, my back pressed against the cold, solid wall that was no longer just a wall. I scrambled back behind the furnace, grabbing the wrench, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped berg. My breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I tried to slow it down, to force a sense of normalcy onto a world that had just been tilted off its axis. I fumbled with the rusted bolt on the pipe, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the tool. Footsteps sounded on the wooden basement stairs. Each step was a drumbeat of doom. He was humming, a tuneless little melody he always hummed after a long day. The sound, once a comfort, was now terrifying. It was the sound of a monster putting on its human face. The bare bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows. "Hey, son," he called out, his voice echoing slightly. "Any luck with that pipe?" I saw his silhouette, the familiar shape of his worn work boots, the slight stoop of his shoulders. I swallowed, my throat dry as dust. "Almost got it, Dad," I managed to say, my voice sounding strained and foreign to my own ears. "Just a stubborn bolt." He came over, peering into the cramped space behind the furnace. I was acutely aware of the secret door just inches from his head. He smelled of rain and wet leaves and the faint, papery scent of mail. It was the smell of my entire childhood. "Yeah, that one's always been a pain," he said, his voice full of the easy, unconcerned warmth I knew so well. "Don't bust a gut. We can call a plumber if you can't get it." He patted my shoulder, a gesture he'd made 1,000 times. The simple, fatherly touch felt like a brand. My skin crawled. I was looking at the back of his head, the familiar graying hair at his temples, and all I could see were the colored strings on the map, a web of deceit spun out from this very man. He was the spider. We were just flies. He went back upstairs, and a few minutes later, the smell of frying onions drifted down, another anchor of normalcy in a world that was anything but. I stayed behind the furnace for a long time, the cold wrench in my hand, listening to the thump of my own blood in my ears. Dinner was torture. We sat at the small kitchen table, the one my mom had picked out 20 years ago. Dad talked about his day. He talked about Mrs. Henderson's new rose bushes, and how little Sarah Miller had lost a tooth and was expecting a visit from the tooth fairy. He recounted it all with his usual gentle humor, the benevolent narrator of our town's small, sweet life. And I sat there, pushing mashed potatoes around my plate, picturing him in that cold, secret room, steaming open a letter from the tooth fairy, a bill for the rose bushes, a note from a lover. Every word he spoke felt like a lie. I watched his hands, calloused and capable, as he cut his meatloaf. These were the same hands that had bandaged my scraped knees, that had taught me to tie a fisherman's knot, that had held my mother's as she slipped away. Now, I could only see them delicately slicing open an envelope, his brow furrowed in concentration under the glare of a high-intensity lamp. The hypocrisy of it was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest and making it hard to breathe. I felt like a stranger at my own family's table, an actor in a play where I was the only one who knew the hero was the villain. "You all right, kiddo?" His voice cut through my thoughts, gentle and concerned. "You've barely touched your food." I looked up from my plate, my eyes meeting his. They were the same eyes that had looked at me with pride at my high school graduation, the same eyes that had welled with tears at my mother's funeral. Now I searched them for a flicker of something else, a shadow, a sign of the man in the basement. I found nothing, just my dad worried about his son. The lie came easily, a bitter taste in my mouth. "Just tired," I mumbled. "Long day. I think I'll just head up." He nodded, his expression softening. "Sure thing. Get some rest." I stood up, my chair scraping against the linoleum, the sound unnaturally loud. I carried my plate to the sink, my movements stiff and robotic. As I rinsed it, I could feel his gaze on my back. It wasn't accusatory or suspicious. It was just his normal paternal watchfulness. And that was so much worse. It felt like I was the one with the terrible secret, the one betraying him. And in a way, I suppose I was. I went to my room and closed the door, leaning against it as if to physically hold the rest of the house at bay. This room had been my sanctuary my whole life. The faded posters of bands I no longer listened to, the dusty trophies from soccer leagues I barely remembered, the pencil marks on the doorframe charting my growth from a small boy into a man. It was a museum of a life I thought I knew. Now it all felt like a set piece in a grand deception. I ran my hand over a framed photo on my nightstand. It was of me and him fishing at Miller's Pond when I was 10. I was holding up a tiny sunfish, grinning a gappy, toothless smile. He had his arm around my shoulder, his face beaming with a simple, uncomplicated pride. Had he gone home that night and steamed open a letter from the Fish and Wildlife Service about lake water quality, or a postcard sent to the Millers from their daughter at college? The paranoia was a vine, wrapping itself around every memory, squeezing the truth out of it. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind a frantic slideshow of images. The colored yarn, the filing cabinets, the glint of light on the steam wand. It wasn't enough to know what he was doing. I had to know why. What was the purpose of it all? Was he selling the information? Blackmailing people? Was he some kind of secret agent? A quiet protector of our town's underbelly? The absurdity of it was almost laughable, but no more absurd than the reality I had stumbled upon. The filing cabinets were the key. Oak Lane, Maple Avenue, Chestnut Drive. He wasn't just collecting secrets, he was organizing them. He was building a library of our lives, an archive of our private pains, our hidden joys, our financial struggles, our secret loves. The thought of it made me sick, but a new feeling was starting to burn through the nausea, a desperate, clawing need to know what was in those drawers. I couldn't live in this house for one more day, couldn't look my father in the eye again without knowing the full extent of his betrayal. I had to go back down there. Tonight. The waiting was the hardest part. I cracked my door and listened to the sounds of the house shutting down. The low murmur of the 10 o'clock news from the living room, the splash of water in the bathroom sink, the familiar, rhythmic squeak of the third step on the main staircase as he came up to bed. Each sound was a landmark on the map of my childhood evenings, but tonight they were a countdown. I heard his bedroom door close, and then silence. A profound, heavy silence that was more terrifying than any noise. The house was finally asleep. I waited another hour, just to be sure, my own heartbeat a frantic drum in the quiet. Every creak of the old house settling, every rustle of leaves against my window pane sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. I was an intruder in my own home, a ghost moving through a life that was no longer mine. Finally, I slipped out of bed. I didn't turn on a light. I moved through the familiar darkness of the hallway, my bare feet silent on the worn wooden floor. I held my breath as I passed his closed bedroom door, half expecting it to swing open, to see him standing there, his face a mask of disappointment. But there was only silence. The stairs were my biggest challenge. I took them one at a time, testing each step with my toe before putting my full weight down, avoiding the ones I knew would groan in protest. It felt like it took an eternity. The air grew colder as I descended, the faint, musty smell of the basement rising to meet me. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my hand finding the familiar, cold brass of the doorknob. I turned it with excruciating slowness, the latch clicking with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. I froze, listening. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I slipped into the basement, pulling the door shut behind me until it was almost closed, leaving only a sliver of an opening. The single bare bulb I'd left on earlier was off now. He must have switched it off after I'd come up. The darkness was absolute. I felt my way along the wall, my fingers tracing the cool, damp concrete until I reached the furnace. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I found the almost invisible seam in the cinder block wall. My hands were shaking, but this time it wasn't just from fear. It was from a grim sense of purpose. I put my fingers into the groove and pulled. The heavy door groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the floor. I stopped, my ears straining for any sound from upstairs. Silence. I pulled again, slower this time, guiding the immense weight of it, fighting gravity and friction with every inch. It opened just enough for me to slip through. The air inside was still and cold, carrying that same strange, sterile scent of paper and ozone I now recognized as ozone from the equipment on the desk. For a moment, I didn't move, just stood there, letting the silence and the blackness swallow me. My own breathing sounded like a bellows in the tomb-like quiet. This was it. There was no turning back, no pretending I hadn't seen this. The only way out was forward, through the secrets my father had buried down here. I needed a light. My hands, still trembling, stretched out in front of me as I shuffled forward, my memory of the room's layout my only guide. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of a filing cabinet, then another. Finally, they found the smooth, cool wood of the desk. I swept my hand across its surface, past the strange steaming device, until I felt the familiar shape of the desk lamp. My thumb found the switch. I hesitated, my heart hammering against my ribs. Pushing this button felt like a bigger transgression than just being in the room. This was an act of deliberate investigation. This was me choosing to see. I clicked it. A pool of green-shaded light flooded the desk and the immediate area, casting the rest of the room in deep, monstrous shadows. The map on the wall loomed, its network of colored yarn like the web of some terrible, patient spider. And there they were, the rows of filing cabinets, silent and imposing. They were the reason I was here. I walked over to the first one, the one labeled A-D. My fingers traced the cold steel of the drawer handle. Oak Lane, Maple Avenue, Chestnut Drive. I pulled on the handle for Chestnut Drive. It slid open with a high, metallic shriek that made me flinch, the sound deafening in the silence. The drawer was packed tight with manila folders, each one neatly labeled with a house number and a family name. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely control them. I didn't know which one to pick. It felt like a violation of a cosmic order, like choosing which soul to peer into. My eyes landed on a name I knew all too well. 114 Chestnut Drive. The Hendersons. Mr. Henderson had been my Little League coach, a kind, booming man who always smelled of freshly cut grass and chewing tobacco. His wife, Sarah, made the best lemonade on the block. Their son, Mark, was a year older than me, the town's golden boy who went off to a fancy university on a full scholarship. They were, by all accounts, the perfect family. I lifted the folder out. It was thicker than I expected. My stomach churned as I carried it back to the desk and sat down in the worn wooden chair. My father's chair. I opened the folder. It wasn't just 1 or 2 letters. It was a curated history of their private lives. The first thing I saw was a letter from a bank dated 2 years ago. It was a final notice for a second mortgage they'd taken out on their house. The language was cold, formal, threatening foreclosure. I remembered Mr. Henderson getting a new truck around that time, telling everyone his landscaping business was booming. It was a lie. Tucked behind that was a thin, flimsy piece of paper, a carbon copy of a pawn shop receipt for a single item, a woman's diamond engagement ring. My breath caught in my throat. I saw another letter, this one from the university Mark attended. It wasn't a friendly update. It was a notice of academic probation. Mark, the genius, was failing. And then, at the very bottom, I found a half-dozen letters held together with a simple paperclip. They were handwritten on pale blue stationery, addressed to Mrs. Henderson. They weren't from a friend. They were from a marriage counselor, gentle but firm follow-ups to appointments that she had apparently been attending alone. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt like a ghoul, sifting through the bones of a life I had no right to see. These weren't just secrets. They were pains, deep, private wounds that this family had been hiding behind a facade of sunny afternoons and perfect lawns. And my father, he knew. He knew it all. He'd known it as he handed Mr. Henderson his mail with a cheerful, "Morning, Bill." He'd known it as he waved to Mrs. Henderson while she was out gardening. He had collected their pain, piece by piece, and filed it away in this cold, dark room. The kindest, the neighborly chats, it was all a lie. He was a vulture, circling, watching. The need to know more became a physical hunger. I carefully put the Hendersons' file back, the papers feeling toxic in my hands, and pulled another. 201 Chestnut Drive. The Millers, the family from the pond. My hands were steadier now, the shock hardening into a cold, grim resolve. Their file was just as thick. A notice from the IRS about an audit, a letter from a specialist at a city hospital confirming a grim diagnosis for Mrs. Miller, a passionate, secret letter to Mr. Miller from a woman who lived 2 towns over. It was all there. Their entire hidden world, laid bare on cheap manila paper. I saw the mundane, too. Seed catalogs, birthday cards from distant relatives, electricity bills. He wasn't just collecting the big secrets. He was collecting everything. He was building a complete picture. This wasn't about blackmail. It wasn't about money. It was about knowing. It was an obsession. My father wasn't just reading the town's mail. He was consuming its soul. My head swam. I leaned back in the chair, the old wood groaning under my weight, and stared at the map on the wall. The colored yarn wasn't just a delivery route. It was a web, and my father was the spider at its center, feeling every twitch, every vibration from every corner of town. He wasn't consuming their souls. He was cataloging them. He was building an archive of our town's collective heart, one stolen secret at a time. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. I had to get up, had to move. I slid the Miller file back into its place, the metal drawer closing with a grim finality. I felt a strange, compulsive pull to keep going, to see how deep this ran. It was no longer just about understanding my father. It was a desperate need to know the real story of the town I grew up in, the town I thought was so simple, so safe. My eyes scanned the drawer labels, E through H, K through M. I stopped at P through S. My hand hovered, then pulled. The drawer shrieked open. My gaze fell on a name that made my stomach clench. Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy, the principal of my old elementary school. He was a town institution, a tall, gentle man with a perfectly trimmed white mustache and a collection of cardigans for every season. He was the moral compass of our little world. I pulled his file, my hands feeling slick with sweat. It was thinner than the others, but that almost made it more ominous. I sat back down at the desk and opened it. There were no letters from banks or secret lovers. Instead, there were pamphlets. Thin, glossy pamphlets for resorts in Atlantic City and Las Vegas. Tucked inside them were slips of paper, betting stubs from a horse track an hour away. And then I saw the letters. They were from his brother, a man who I didn't even know existed. The first view were friendly, catching up. But the tone quickly soured. The handwriting grew more frantic, the sentences underlined. David, you can't ask me for more. I have my own family to think of. You promised me last time was the last time. The final letter was a single typed page from a lawyer, a formal notice that his brother was cutting off all contact and would no longer be responsible for his debts. A memory, sharp and sudden, pierced through my shock. I was maybe 12 years old, walking home from school with my dad after he finished his route. We saw Mr. Abernathy getting out of his car. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped. My dad called out to him, a big friendly wave. Tough day at the office, Dave? Mr. Abernathy forced a smile. You know how it is, Frank. The kids run you ragged. And then my dad clapped him on the shoulder, his voice dropping a little lower, a conspiratorial tone I didn't understand at the time. Well, he'd said, here's hoping your luck turns around. Mr. Abernathy's smile vanished. He just nodded, a deep sadness in his eyes, and walked into his house. I had thought it was such a strange thing to say. Now, sitting in this cold, dark room, the memory was sickening. My father wasn't offering a vague encouragement. He was twisting the knife. He was showing Mr. Abernathy, in the most subtle way imaginable, that he knew. He knew everything. The question of how clawed at my mind. How did he do this so flawlessly for 30 years? My eyes drifted across the desk, past the lamp, and landed on the strange little device I'd noticed before. It was a small electric kettle, the kind you might use to boil water for a single cup of tea. But a thin copper tube had been soldered to the spout, leading to a fine, delicate nozzle like a dentist's tool. It was aimed at a small metal cradle, perfectly sized to hold an envelope. Steam. My blood ran cold. He used steam. It was so simple, so patient, so horrifyingly clever. He would hold the sealed flap of an envelope over the jet of steam until the glue softened, then gently peel it open. I looked around the desk and saw the rest of the kit. A small jar of a specific clear adhesive, a bone folder, a smooth flat tool used in bookbinding for pressing the flap shut again without leaving a crease, a set of tweezers for handling the letters without leaving fingerprints. This wasn't the work of an amateur. This was a craft, honed and perfected over thousands of hours, in thousands of stolen moments. I pictured him down here, night after night, the green lamp casting its sickly glow on his face, the gentle hiss of the steam, the delicate peeling back of a stranger's privacy, the quiet satisfaction as he read their joys, their sorrows, their shames. The man who taught me how to properly stack firewood, who insisted on ironing his uniform every single morning, who lectured me on the importance of honesty and a firm handshake, that man applied the same meticulous care and dedication to this violation. He wasn't a monster in the way I understood monsters. He was something else, something quieter, more patient. He was a craftsman of secrets, and this room, this archive of pain and truth, was his masterpiece. I felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, as if the concrete floor had tilted beneath my feet. I pushed the chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the ground, and stood up. I had to pace, had to walk off the sudden suffocating knowledge. I put my hand on the cold steel of a filing cabinet to steady myself. A craftsman? The word echoed in my head. It was so much worse than being a monster. A monster was chaotic, destructive. A craftsman was precise, deliberate, proud of his work. My father wasn't just violating people, he was perfecting the art of it. Every sealed envelope was a challenge, a puzzle he'd meticulously solved night after night for 30 years. The sheer discipline of it was what made my stomach turn. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a life's work. My eyes fell back on the rows of drawers. The urge to flee was a screaming instinct, but it was drowned out by a darker, more powerful current. The need to know. It felt like a sickness he had passed down to me, this insatiable hunger for the truth hidden just beneath the surface. I was standing in the heart of our town's collective secret, and I couldn't bring myself to walk away. My hand, acting of its own accord, slid to the next cabinet. The label read G-J. I pulled the handle. The drawer slid open with a low metallic groan, releasing a fresh wave of that musty archival smell. My breath caught in my throat. Gable, Eleanor. My gaze was fixed on the tab. Mrs. Gable. She lived next door to us my entire life. She was the one who gave me cookies after school, who let me help in her garden, whose house smelled perpetually of cinnamon and lavender. After my mom died, she was the one who would show up at our door with a casserole, her eyes full of a quiet, genuine sympathy. She was a second grandmother to me. Her file was thick, much thicker than the principal's. I lifted it out, the weight of it feeling obscene in my hands. I carried it back to the desk, to the single pool of light from the lamp, as if I were bringing an offering to some dark god. I sat down and opened it. The first few items were what I expected. Bank statements, a copy of her late husband's will, letters from her cousin in Florida. But then I found a bundle of letters tied with a faded red ribbon. The postmarks were from Oregon, and they were dated from over 40 years ago. They were from a woman named Sarah, who identified herself as Eleanor's sister. But Mrs. Gable had always told me she was an only child. I unfolded the first letter, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The handwriting was desperate, pleading. Ellie, you can't just disappear. You can't leave him. He's your son. He asks for you every day. What am I supposed to tell him? I read on, letter after letter, a story unfolding that turned the warm, kind woman I knew into a stranger. A young, terrified mother, a hasty marriage, a life she had run away from, changing her name and inventing a new past for herself in our sleepy, unsuspecting town. The final piece of paper in the bundle wasn't a letter, it was a photograph, creased and worn. A young woman who was unmistakably Mrs. Gable stood beside a man I didn't recognize, and in her arms she held a small baby. On the back, written in faint pencil, it said, Eleanor, Michael, and baby Thomas, 1978. I dropped the photo as if it had burned my fingers. All those years, all those cookies, all those gentle smiles, they were all built on a foundation of lies. She hadn't just moved here for a fresh start after being widowed. She had abandoned a family. She had abandoned a child. And my father knew. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was a teenager, mowing our lawn on a hot July afternoon. My dad was on the porch, drinking a lemonade, watching Mrs. Gable meticulously weed her rose bushes. He called over to her, his voice carrying easily in the summer air. You've got a real gift for that, Eleanor, making things beautiful. It's like you can just pluck out all the roots you don't want and pretend they were never there. She froze, her back to us. I remembered thinking it was an odd compliment. But she didn't turn around. She just stayed there for a long moment, perfectly still, before slowly resuming her work. My dad took a long sip of his lemonade, a placid, unreadable expression on his face. He wasn't complimenting her gardening. He was reminding her that he held her old roots in his hands, right here, in this basement. He was letting her know that her carefully constructed new life existed only by his silent permission. A cold fury, purer and hotter than anything I had felt before, surged through me. This wasn't just about knowing. This was about power, the quiet, unspoken power to hold someone's entire world in your hands and to gently, almost imperceptibly, squeeze. He wasn't a spider feeling the vibrations in his web. He was the one plucking the strands just to watch the little flies dance. I shoved her file back into the drawer with so much force, the whole cabinet rattled. I was done with other people's secrets. I was done with the neighbors and the teachers and the town officials. The circle of my father's knowledge was closing in, and there was only one place left to go. My movements were stiff, robotic, as I walked to the last filing cabinet, the one tucked away in the darkest corner of the room. My own last name started with a C. I found the drawer labeled B-D. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the cold metal a stark contrast to my feverish skin. What did he know about my mother? What did he know about me? For the first time, I was truly afraid of what I might find. The drawer slid open with a sound like a final breath. It was a low, scraping groan that seemed to echo the protest in my own bones. For a moment, I just stared into the hanging folders, the neatly printed tabs, a testament to a horrifying domestic order. I saw the names of families I knew, people we'd had over for barbecues, people I'd gone to school with. But my eyes were searching for only one tab. And then I saw it. It wasn't flashy. It was typed on the same simple label maker as all the others. Clayton, Daniel, and family. The word family felt like a cruel joke. We weren't a family. We were a collection, a file, an exhibit in his private museum. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hook my fingers around the thick manila folder. It was heavier than Mrs. Gable's. Of course it was. He'd had a lifetime to fill it. I didn't take it back to the desk. I couldn't. I sank to the floor right there, the cold concrete seeping through my jeans, and pulled the contents into my lap. The first thing I saw was a thin file labeled with my mother's name, Maria. Inside weren't bank statements or official documents, but letters, a thick stack of them, written in her elegant, looping cursive on pale blue stationery. They were all addressed to her sister, my Aunt Carol, who lived in California, but they were pristine, unfolded, uncreased, without a single stamp. They had never been mailed. My father had intercepted them. Or perhaps she had never even dared to try and send them. I opened the one on top, dated just a few years before she died. Quote, "Carol," it began, "some days I feel like this town is a glass jar and Dan is standing on the outside, just tapping on it. He doesn't have to yell or scream, he just taps. That constant quiet sound, that constant watching. He says it's because he loves me, because he wants to protect me, but it doesn't feel like protection. It feels like ownership." I read another and another. A secret history of my mother's life unfolded in my hands. The vibrant woman I remembered from my childhood was a ghost. In her place was a woman suffocating under the weight of my father's quiet, meticulous control. She wrote about her loneliness, about feeling like an actress playing the part of the happy mailman's wife. She wrote about wanting to go back to school, to become a nurse, a dream my father had gently, reasonably talked her out of. It was too much stress, he'd said. Her place was here, with me, with him. He had curated her life just as he curated these files, trimming away any root that might grow in a direction he hadn't planned. The love I thought had defined our home was just another one of his meticulously crafted illusions. Underneath her letters was a smaller file with my name on it, David. I opened it with a sense of numb dread. There were my report cards, a few drawings I'd made in kindergarten, things a normal parent would keep. But tucked behind them were loose sheets of paper filled with my father's small, neat handwriting. They were notes, observations. Quote, "June 12th. David lied about breaking the neighbor's window, showed no remorse until confronted with evidence, a tendency for self-preservation over honesty. This is her influence." Another, May 3rd. He cried after the argument about his curfew. The tears felt manipulative. He knows how to use emotion to get what he wants. Must be careful not to reinforce this. It went on and on, a clinical, detached analysis of my entire childhood. I wasn't his son. He was a long-term study. Every scraped knee, every bad grade, every teenage argument wasn't a memory we shared. It was a data point he collected, a piece of evidence he filed away. He wasn't raising a son. He was monitoring a subject. My hands were numb, my whole body felt like it was encased in ice. There was one last thing at the bottom of the main folder. It was a single folded piece of my mother's blue stationery. It was the last letter she ever wrote. It was dated the week before she died. It wasn't addressed to my Aunt Carol. It was addressed to him, to my father. Dan, it said, my mother's handwriting shaky, desperate. I can't do this anymore. I can't live in this beautiful, perfect cage you've built for us. I feel your eyes on me even when you're not here. I know you read my mail. I know you listen to my calls. This isn't a marriage. It's a prison sentence. I'm taking David and I'm leaving. Don't try to find us. I just want us to be free. The letter was never sent. He had found it. He knew. He knew she was going to take me away from him. My blood ran cold as I saw what was tucked behind her unsent Declaration of Independence. It was a thin, official-looking document, a copy of her death certificate. I scanned the page, my eyes blurring until I found the words I was looking for. Cause of death, accidental overdose. Prescription sedatives. An accident, a terrible, tragic accident, everyone had said. My father had been so stoic, so brave. He had held me at the funeral and told me that sometimes things just happen that we can't understand. But he understood. He had understood everything. He had stood by, tapping on the glass, and watched her die. I don't know how long I sat there on the cold concrete floor with the story of my mother's quiet desperation in my lap. Time seemed to stop. The only sound was the frantic, paper-thin beat of my own heart. He didn't just let her die. It was worse than that. He had cultivated her despair. He had tended to it, watered it, pruned away any chance of escape until it was the only thing left in her life that was truly hers. He hadn't pushed her. He had simply locked the last door and waited. The grief I had carried for my mother my whole life was a cheap imitation, a story he had authored for me. The real grief was this, a raw, howling thing that tore through me now. It was the grief for the woman I never knew, the life she never got to live, the freedom she died trying to reach. I carefully, mechanically, put everything back in the folder, except for her last letter. I folded it and slid it into my pocket. It felt both heavy and fragile, like a dead bird. Slowly, I got to my feet. My legs were stiff, my body ached with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. I didn't look back at the filing cabinets. I didn't need to. The museum was closed. I walked out of the room, leaving the door ajar, and ascended the basement stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, a familiar, homey sound that now sounded like a scream. The house upstairs was the same framed photos on the wall, of me on a tricycle, of my parents on their wedding day, my mother's smile bright and genuine, a relic from a time before the glass jar had fully descended. It was all a lie. A set, a carefully curated stage for his perfect life. I walked into the living room. He was there, of course, sitting in his favorite armchair, the reading lamp casting a warm, golden glow on the newspaper in his hands. He looked up as I entered, a mild, pleasant smile on his face, the same smile he gave Mrs. Gable when he handed her the mail. "David," he said, folding his paper, "you were quiet down there. Find what you were looking for?" His voice was calm, casual, as if I'd just been looking for an old photo album. My own voice, when it came out, was a stranger's, a dry, rasping thing. I found Mom's letters. I watched his face. The smile didn't vanish. It just tightened, became something brittle and knowing. He didn't feign surprise or confusion. He just gave a small, slow nod, as if I'd finally solved a puzzle he'd set for me long ago. "Ah!" was all he said. I pulled the folded blue stationery from my pocket and held it out. My hand was shaking violently now, the paper fluttering between my fingers. "She was leaving you," I said, the words tasting like poison. She was taking me with her. He looked at the letter, then back at me. His eyes weren't the eyes of a monster from a movie. They were just my father's eyes, clear and steady and filled with a terrible, patient certainty. "She was unwell, David," he said, his voice soft, reasonable, the same voice he'd used to talk her out of nursing school. "She was impulsive. She had these ideas, these fantasies. They weren't good for her. They weren't good for you. She would have taken you away from this home, this town, from everything you knew. She would have destroyed your life for a whim." He spoke of her desire for freedom as if it were a sickness. He was the doctor, and his control was the cure. "So you just let her die?" I whispered, the question hanging in the air between us, thick and suffocating. "You read this. You knew she was at the end of her rope, and you did nothing?" He finally stood up, placing his newspaper neatly on the end table. He walked towards me, and for a second, I flinched, thinking he might strike me. But he just placed a hand on my shoulder. His touch was heavy, proprietary. "Doing nothing is a choice, son. Sometimes it's the hardest choice of all. Your mother was going to shatter our family. I was protecting it. I was protecting you. She made her decision, locked in her room with a bottle of pills. My only decision was whether to let her selfish act tear you apart too. I chose you. I have always chosen you." There was no remorse, no guilt, only the unshakable conviction of a man who believed his web was the entire world and that his duty was to manage every vibration within it. I finally understood. He hadn't just watched her die, he had seen it as a solution, a neat, tidy end to a messy problem. He had filed her away, just like everything else. I shrugged his hand off my shoulder. The warmth of his touch felt like a burn. I looked at him, at this man who had been the center of my entire world, and I saw a stranger, a jailer, a ghost. I turned and walked to the front door without another word. There was nothing left to say. You can't reason with a god in his own universe. I could hear him behind me, his voice following me, still calm, still certain. "David, don't be foolish. Where are you going to go? This is your home." I opened the door. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time since I'd stepped into that basement, I took a full, deep breath. It was the breath my mother never got to take. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me, the click of the latch echoing like a final, severed connection. I didn't look back. I just started walking down the driveway away from the warm lights of the house, away from the man who loved me so much he had curated my entire life and my mother's death. The street was quiet, the houses dark. Everything looked the same, but I knew the truth now. I knew about the invisible threads running from my father's house to every other home on the street, a network of secrets and quiet control. He hadn't just been reading the mail. He had been reading the town's soul, and in doing so, he had lost his own. When does protection become a prison, and when does love become the lock on the door?
Don't forget to like and subscribe. I post new stories every day.